Great to be joined by Rick Broering today on the Rebound Rundown, the publisher of MusketeerReport.com and NKU's radio analyst. If you're watching this on YouTube, go make sure you subscribe on all the podcast platforms, Apple, Spotify, iHeart, the rest. You can see them down there. Make sure you go subscribe for the full episode. But talking here today about Xavier and NKU, and we're going to start with the Norse, Rick, because it's been a little bit since we've caught up about Northern Kentucky, and they've made a push here toward the end of the season. They're coming off a 2-0 weekend, a really nice win against Wright State on Friday, and then they held on against IU Indy on Sunday. You looking at how those games ended, I talked about it on yesterday's show. NKU was the team that got the stops at the end on Friday. Dan Goresger came up huge with a late three. Then on Sunday, it was Northern Kentucky that didn't score down the stretch, but they had a big enough lead that they were able to hold on. Let's do the macro first on NKU and where they are, and then take us through these last couple of games because, like I said, there's only 2 regular season games left.
Yeah, well, Paul, it seemed like the calendar flipped to February, and then NKU reeled off 5 wins in their next 7 games. Stop me if you've heard this before. I mean, it's amazing how every year, even when it seems improbable and it seems like, oh, maybe this year they just don't have it, this staff finds a way to get them playing their best basketball at the right time of year. And again, there are some flaws with this team for sure. Will they show up in the tournament and be able to get back to Indianapolis for the semifinals and have a shot? Who knows? But they're giving themselves a chance. They look like a team that's capable of doing that now. And you couldn't have said that at the end of January when they had lost, 4 in a row? Or rather make it like 6 in a row, 7 in a row, something like that. It was a long losing stretch
in a row
there.
Between the 8th and the 30th of January. Yeah,
it was a long losing skid that they had there in January. And they've really flipped it around. So I think that's kind of the big picture stuff. Now, the games that you were talking about over this weekend, obviously there were some tense moments in the final few minutes of both of those games, but in both games, I think you saw a few things that this team has lacked throughout the season, and that's making the tough defensive plays when it matters most. They've shown the ability to guard and turn up the intensity and generate turnovers in their matchup zone, their fist defense for periods of a game, but then when the game's on the line, they haven't bowed their back and been as tough. And in these games, they were. Keanu Tijere had some special defensive moments in the final possessions of both of these games. And when you have your 6'9" super athletic center guarding all over the court, playing on the perimeter, blocking shots at the rim in the game's most important possessions, it really gives you an edge.
Looking at how NKU has been able to turn a corner here, I think one of the points that you made to me during that losing streak in January, where I asked you off the air, we were just talking about NKU, and I just said, Rick, what's the problem here? What's going on with NKU? And one of the points that you made to me back then was they need more out of Dan Goresger. You kept waiting and waiting for him, and now you started to see him pick it up a little bit here, and especially with that 3 that he hit the other day. Have you been impressed by the progress he's made? Has he been just catching lightning in a bottle, or what's the update with him?
No, I mean, he has definitely turned a corner, Paul, and it is amazing because earlier in the year, we talked about how he just completely lacked any confidence on the offensive end. And now, I mean, he started this IU Indy game 0 for 5 from the field and 0 for 3 from 3-point range. And then he ended up, as you mentioned, knocking down some of the biggest shots of the game. They put the ball in his hands when it was clutch time in both the Wright State and the IU Indy games. He finished with 17 against Wright State and ended up with 15 against IU Indy in that game where he had started 0 for 5. So, Paul, there's no doubt that he's playing with a lot of confidence now. He's a completely different player. And for NKU, it's made everyone else better because now you're asking your Division II transfer and 3-point sniper Josh Dilling to just spot up, find open spots on the perimeter, do what you do best as a 3-point shooter. You no longer have to make plays and carry the offense as a point guard. And for Sam Vincent, who's coming off an ACL injury and hasn't been scoring as much this season for the Norse, he's been able to kind of slide off the ball again, not do as much playmaking on the offensive end, leave that to Goresger. And it's added more, it seems like, vitality to his overall game on the defensive end and as a rebounder and as an overall player again. So it's kind of really jump-started this whole team, it seems like, since Dan started playing much better and with more confidence.
2 games left for NKU here before we start talking about Xavier. Purdue-Fort Wayne on Thursday, and then Youngstown State on Saturday to wrap up the regular season. overall thoughts on those two games, especially that last game of the regular season against Youngstown State at home?
Yeah, well, in the Purdue-Fort Wayne game, the first time these two teams played, it was a home game at Truist Arena, and NKU won that one in overtime. They needed a big comeback to get that done. So I imagine that one will be an exciting one. Again, these two teams seem to have some interesting battles over the last few years. I'm curious to see how they match up with Purdue-Fort Wayne's speed on the offensive end and their three-point shooting ability. And then the game against Youngstown State, it'll be interesting to see how NKU responds, because the first meeting between these teams, NKU was beat by 11 points, and they didn't really handle the physicality of Youngstown State well inside. They had a couple of guys, including Gabe Dines, the Simon Kenton product from Independence, Kentucky, a local guy who obviously, it's got to be big for him to go up against NKU, the hometown school where he's from. He played really well off the bench, ended up with 11 points and 15 rebounds in that game, 5 of them on the offensive end. So NKU is going to have to do a better job of matching that physicality and playing better inside.
All right. Now let's talk about Xavier. Musketeers coming off a 4-game winning streak right now. They have a bye week before a massive game against Creighton on Saturday afternoon at the Cintas Center. Xavier's reeled off wins against Providence, DePaul, Butler, and Seton Hall. The game on Saturday got a little dicey against the Pirates, but they were able to hold on. And, to Xavier's credit, the way the game ended against Seton Hall was exactly how Seton Hall was able to beat UConn just a week earlier. Just grind it down, start pressing, create turnovers, just chunk the game up. Xavier was able to survive it because they had built up at one point in the second half a 21-point lead. Xavier, just looking at how the rest of the regular season lines up, you have Creighton at home, Butler on the road, Providence at home. If Xavier goes 3-0 here, they'd end the season on a 7-game winning streak. And at that point, you have to be feeling pretty good about your chances to make the NCAA tournament. I don't think they'd be a lock at that point, but you'd have to be feeling pretty good that you'd be on the right side of the bubble on Selection Sunday. Rick, what are your thoughts on how Xavier has handled these last couple of games and what kind of position they're in heading into this game against Creighton on Saturday?
It's impressive, Paul. I mean, you can say they were expected to win these games or they're supposed to win these games, and that's true. But at the same time, they haven't consistently won every game that they were supposed to win. They haven't consistently been able to put their foot down when they've gotten a lead and win. And yes, I know they let Seton Hall come back in that game, but those were the games that they were not just letting a team come back, but they were losing the lead and not being able to get themselves right in the final minute to save the game. At least that didn't happen. And I know Seton Hall is one of the worst teams in the country, obviously at the high major level, but it's been a strong effort to this point through the first 4 games. The big one, though, comes on Saturday. If you can get through Creighton, then it becomes real. And now you've got a real chance to do this thing. I think everyone's been pointing to that Creighton game since the start of this 7-game stretch where you knew they kind of had to win out to really give themselves a chance. And they've done a great job to this point to get here, but now this is the real test.
It's interesting looking at how the quads are stacking up for Xavier toward the end of this season, because there was a point in time about a month ago where you're sitting there thinking maybe UConn and Creighton can get up into quad 1 home games. Doesn't look like that's going to be the case, because UConn is sitting at 36 or 37 right now, depending on where they are when we all wake up on Tuesday morning as you're listening to this. But a product of Xavier winning this game on Saturday will mean that they can't move up much farther. So are they really going to jump another 7-8 spots to get up into quad 1? And it looks like UConn kind of the same way. They're likely not going to jump up back into quad 1 either. They're not playing like a team right now that will do that. Butler's actually the team of all of this group that has the best chance to move up. They're just a couple of spots out right now. If they can maybe finish strong here, that maybe that quad 1 or that road game can jump back up into quad 1. But Xavier now playing this type of basketball going into a Saturday home game against Creighton, is it overly dramatic, Rick, to say that you're playing for the season here? Or do you think that if Xavier was to drop a game against Creighton or Butler, that you're still in the conversation? Because I think they probably still would be at least like in the conversation. But to me, going 3-0 puts you in a great spot.
I be honest, I just don't see how they still make it if they lose this game against Creighton. I think most of the bracketologists will still have them close to the cut line based on the metrics and based on the way the bubble is falling, but I don't think any of them at that point will feel comfortable putting them into the field based on their resume and what they've done. So I think this is a big one, Paul. It feels like this is the game to save their season, so to speak.
I want to ask you to go back real quick to the end of the Seton Hall game, because you touched on it, and it's something that Xavier has struggled with, obviously, through the whole season, is how they close out games. So Monday, I went back and rewatched the second half of the game, and particularly the last 10 minutes down the stretch. Xavier attempted in the final 10 minutes of the game, they had officially 8 field goal attempts, 10 of them if you want to count 2 shot clock violations. But only one shot in the last 10 minutes came with more than 13 seconds left on the shot clock, and that was that Marcus Foster wing 3 with about 1:40 left, where he took it with, I think, 26 seconds left on the shot clock. But for the most part, I think they may have had a tip in there as well. But pretty much every shot in the last 10 minutes of the game, what I'm getting at here, came in the last 13 seconds of the shot clock. Is that a product of what Xavier is trying to do there at the end of the game, where they want to just take the air out of the ball? Or is that a product of how the game flow happened, with Seton Hall slowing things down, turning it into a press, and that's just how it ended?
No, I mean, that's obviously at that point of the game, it is partly because Xavier is trying to run some offense, run some clock. They don't want to get into a game where they're just running up and down the floor, missing shots, and allowing Seton Hall to have that opportunity with enough possessions to get right back in the game. It is a calculated risk on the part of the coaching staff and that style of play, but it worked for one. They did win the game ultimately, even though Seton Hall made that comeback. Xavier did hang on and win it. At the same time, Paul, I think there's probably more of a happy medium that they'd like to strike there. I don't think the coaching staff was necessarily saying we have to hold it to the end of the shot clock on every possession. But the problem that this Xavier team has, I think, at times is, okay, you get it into the front court, you beat the press initially, but when you don't attack it for a quick basket and you don't punish a team like Seton Hall for applying all that pressure and overextending itself, well, then it's really difficult for this team to handle that pressure once it gets into the front court and handle those bumps from this physical Seton Hall team that's more athletic. And then when they try to run their offense, they get stopped up and it's hard to rotate the ball. And all of a sudden they find themselves with a grenade at the end of the shot clock. And I think that's what happened to them more often than not in those final minutes.
Do you think the bye week right now, coming off 4 straight wins, helps Xavier? Or where do you lie on the rest versus rust?
I think it definitely helps them right now because they have had pretty back-to-back-to-back weeks here where you're playing in short succession, quick turnaround games. This not only gives you a chance to get everyone kind of healed up and refreshed a little bit, but it also allows you to have some real practices again and put all of your focus into a full game prep week for Creighton. And maybe certainly your most important game that's left now, but really one of the most important games on the season. When it started, we knew this was going to be a big one for Xavier. So that's big to have the week off.
Any thoughts, Rick, just on players in particular? And this is my last question here to you, is Dante Maddox feels like he's taken a major step in the last few weeks. Anybody else that sticks out to you as a player or players that you feel like Xavier maybe, off the beaten path? That, obviously we've talked about Fremantle being the most consistent player for Xavier, but does anybody else besides Maddox and Fremantle stick out to you here going into the month of March?
Well, I'm kind of curious about Jerome Hunter and Marcus Foster right now. 2 guys to me that feel a bit inconsistent, and also maybe heading in opposite directions a little bit. It feels like Marcus Foster has been fading recently, not playing as well, and it feels like Jerome Hunter at times has given them a little bit more recently. Now, not consistently necessarily, but there have been those sparks, those signs of Jerome Hunter starting to be a little bit more like the guy that finished up that, 2022-23 season before he sat out last year. So again, I don't know that you're going to get the guy who was playing like he did against Texas that year in the NCAA tournament, but I think you can still get a lot out of him.
For sure. All right, Rick. I appreciate you joining the show. Where can people find your stuff, both through Xavier and NKU?
Yeah, obviously find me on Twitter at Rick Broering, and then find any of the Xavier coverage at Musketeer Report. Look us up on Facebook, doing a lot of Facebook coverage now.
Yeah, big back in the Facebook game, Rick. You're bringing it back. All right. Appreciate it, Rick.
Thanks, Paul.